This video was made possible by Olafly. Unlimited data in China and all of Asia. No roaming charges. More in a moment. Detroit, 1920s and 1930s. One of the wealthiest cities on the planet. The automobile industry was booming. Hundreds of thousands of Americans migrated there in search of good jobs in the auto industry. The Motor City seemed unstoppable. Almost overnight, however, everything changed. The car factories established during the first half of the 20th century needed major renovations and investments to adapt to the current times. And the problem was that Detroit never managed to do that. Detroit ceased to offer the best conditions to the automotive world. It ceased to be an attractive place for companies and their workers. After that, the motor industry collapsed completely. So much so that from 1950 until now, and due to the economic disaster, the population fell by more than 60%. Now the city of Detroit is a succession of abandoned houses, a magnet for crime, drug addiction, neglect. It was not even a shadow of what it once was. Welcome to Stuttgart, year 2023. What you are looking at now is one of the great motoring capitals of Europe. This place would be more or less the equivalent to the Detroit of the 1920s, but in today's Europe. Here you will find the head offices of Mercedes-Benz, Porsche, as well as suppliers of key components for the automotive industry such as Bosch, Mahler, or Airbespecher. But they are not the only ones. In this area, there are more than 400 companies supplying automotive components and services, a network that directly employs more than 120,000 people. However, if we broaden our vision further and look at Europe as a whole, we find that the automobile is one of the great economic and even technological drivers of the old continent. It represents around 10% of all manufacturing activity, 7% of all jobs in the European Union, and is Europe's leading export sector. Not only that, but the automotive sector is also the largest private contributor to innovation in Europe. This sector invests some 59 billion euros a year. That's 60 billion US dollars in R&D, accounting for no less than 31% of all R&D investment in the entire European Union. Surprised? Well, with all this data, I'm absolutely sure that most of you, especially those of you who are watching us from outside of Europe, will be thinking that the European politicians are indulging the automotive industry, that it is the sector that is pampered, overprotected, and cared for par excellence, both by the governments of each country and the EU authorities themselves, right? Well, with the data in hand, nothing could be further from the truth. Logic does not always coincide with the ideas of European politicians, and this is a good example because how would you feel if we told you that the bureaucrats in Brussels seem to be doing everything possible to kill the main profitable and advanced industry that remains in Europe? What if I told you that policies are being implemented that, for many analysts, clearly favor the automotive industry in countries like China to the detriment of the local industry? Could China wipe out the automotive industry in Europe? China remains an ever-expanding powerhouse, moving at an impressive pace to consolidate its position as a world leader. It is highly likely that industry will increasingly become an attraction for thousands of travelers globally, leading it to become a hotspot for business travel. It is well known that your business cannot thrive if your cell phone is not working properly, as the phone is where meetings are held, along with daily applications, investment tracking, among other things. Therefore, it is essential to have a solution that allows you to keep using it while traveling, thus avoiding costly roaming charges or complications with changing plastic SIM cards in places where you don't understand the language, and you may be in emergency situations late at night without support with an unusable card, leaving you completely unprotected. Today, thanks to technological advances, you can connect anywhere in the world easily. With Olafly's International Digital SIM Card, or eSIM, you can connect from wherever you want, whenever you need it, simply by verifying the duration you require. This solution provides you with unlimited data in less than 1 minute in China, Japan, USA, and more than 180 destinations. You will be able to maintain your productivity during the trip through a digital installation via the QR code. And if you need help, you will have 24/7 support available. Before you arrive in China, activate your plan and you'll be ready to stay connected with unlimited data without worrying about losing your connection. Use your apps, hold meetings, access your social media, use maps, Uber, and other apps without worrying about running out of data, and make the most of your travel experience, whether it's for business or tourism. Find out more about Olafly's innovative eSIM technology by visiting the link in the description, and don't ever be disconnected from the world around you.
Regulatory obsolescence.
Global warming, or climate change, depending on who you talk to, has become one of the central themes of European Union policy. And no, we don't intend to get into the debate of whether or not this is justified, but the reality is that all of these policies are already having a huge impact on our lives. Not only in terms of mobility, but also in industry, agriculture, and even leisure, as is the case, for example, when we talk about travel for tourism. Even so, have we really stopped to reflect on the implications that many of these policies that are being proposed may have? You see, as far as automobiles are concerned, the European Union has approved a series of regulations that will restrict and even prohibit the manufacture and marketing of vehicles with combustion engines as of 2035. The exception will be those capable of using carbon-neutral synthetic fuels, an exception included at the last minute, under pressure from a group of countries led by Germany and Italy. The point is that these regulations are likely to increase the cost of access to new vehicles, something that is already happening. You see, today, the price of an electric car is between 30 and 40% higher than that of a combustion or hybrid car of equivalent range. This is a metric that can improve. It is true, but the pressure on copper and lithium prices, among other resources, could also keep this gap in place for quite some time. In fact, it is becoming increasingly difficult to find affordable vehicles, or even any vehicle under 30,000 euros. And no wonder, as you can see in this graph, the price of vehicles in Europe has been skyrocketing in recent years. And not only that, now the decline of the European automotive industry is starting to be a clear cause for concern for the major manufacturers, and also for the countries where this industry has the strongest presence, Germany and France. Why? Well, due to the increasingly higher prices as a result of new regulations and new mobility restrictions that are starting to be everywhere, people have started to go for cheaper electric options. And this is where we get to the crux of this whole issue. According to automotive component supplier Forvia, manufacturing a Chinese electric car costs on average 10,000 euros less than manufacturing a European electric car. What's more, according to industry experts, the engineering, technological, and mechanical complexity of electric cars is much lower than that of combustion vehicles. For example, making an electric car is much simpler than making a combustion engine car that complies with the Euro 6 emissions standard, which is currently in force in Europe. In other words, Chinese companies have it much easier in this field. Do you know what that means? Precisely that China has every chance of becoming a major beneficiary of policies set by Brussels. In fact, the number of Chinese cars on European roads has skyrocketed. The question is, to what extent does this pose a risk to Europe's largest industry? Well, we're going to take a look at that right now.
The end of the European motor industry?
Let's be clear. Yes, European automotive companies have more than enough reason to be concerned. It is a simple question of economy of scale and industrial specialization. We already told you at the beginning of this video how the European motor industry is fundamental to the economy of the old continent, both for the millions of jobs it provides and for its positive balance of trade and its huge investments in R&D. Even so, there is a problem. Virtually the entire European automotive sector revolves around the combustion engine. And we're not just talking about the big brands that you're all thinking of, such as the Volkswagen Group, Renault, or Stellantis. We are talking above all about the dozens and dozens, hundreds of companies that supply components to the major manufacturers, companies that are highly specialized in the mechanics of the combustion car.
The technology of electric motors is simpler than that of combustion engines. There are fewer parts and therefore less maintenance and less risk of breakdown.
This may sound like a very good thing, and it certainly is, but it is also what explains why China, with far less technical capability in terms of vehicles, has become a dangerous direct competitor in just a few years. This is the challenge, the great challenge, not only for the automotive industry, but also for all major European economies. We are talking about a change that could leave many bodies along the way. It will not be easy to adapt the entire production chain to a very different technology, and what's more, to start competing head-to-head with new rivals from countries such as China. Asian competition promises to be very tough. The European Union now risks losing millions of jobs and a colossal source of wealth. But let's take a concrete example. These days, China is the world's largest manufacturer of batteries for electric vehicles. It manufactures twice as many batteries as all the other countries in the world put together. To give you an idea of what we are talking about, just one company, Contemporary Amperex Technology, manufactures 30% of all EV batteries on the planet. Of course, it also supplies Western, Japanese, and Korean brands. Well, this formidable economy of scale has made China tremendously competitive when it comes to electric cars and plug-in hybrids. In the Asian giant, almost 6 million electric cars were sold in 2022, and if we add other types of electrified vehicles, that figure soars to almost 9 million units. In fact, by 2035, which happens to be the year the European Union plans to implement the ban on combustion engines, China could already be selling 25 million electric cars per year worldwide. This is a massive change from the reality of recent decades.
China's lead in electric vehicles is unassailable. The global north simply can't compete.
All this industry created almost overnight, and with a lot of public support, has generated a cluster in China of about 200 different manufacturers of electric vehicles. Among the most prominent, we can find companies such as BYD, SGMW, and Chery. And yes, many of these companies have suddenly become very common, very familiar on European roads, either those same brands or with others specific to the Western market. As if all this were not enough, a large part of the minerals needed to manufacture an electric car are also under Chinese control in one way or another. Take a look at this graph. China controls the production of minerals such as lithium, graphite, cobalt, and rare earths, either because they themselves are a major producer or because they operate mines in other countries with large reserves of these minerals in Africa, Latin America, or Southeast Asia. To give you an idea, and staying with the example of Germany, no less than 91.8% of the raw materials imported by the Germans to produce batteries for electric vehicles also come from China. And if we add labor costs to all this vertical control of the electric car production chain, which are much lower than those of the European industry, we have the perfect cocktail for Chinese dominance in this sector to spread. In fact, many Western manufacturers are already being forced to build electric car factories in China to try to take advantage of its huge market and massive economies of scale in order to compete on costs at home.
Elon Musk looks past geopolitical risks, announces a second Tesla factory in China.
Even many Western brands are directly opting not so much to compete, but to ally with Chinese companies, simply to be able to comply with Brussels' environmental regulations. For example, Volkswagen has gone so far as to forge an alliance with SAIC, the Chinese company that markets MG cars, just to be able to meet Brussels' CO2 emission targets between 2020 and 2022. In other words, the doors are suddenly being opened wide to Chinese competition. And it's being done thanks to new regulations, not free competition. But all in all, the biggest problem, as we've already seen, is the enormous presence that the automobile industry has in Europe. This is another of the great threats looming over the old continent. We may be on the verge of the disappearance of a significant part of the European industrial fabric. The question is, does all this have a solution? Well, let's take a look.
Can the giant be stopped?
Many of you who are watching us will be thinking of two possible solutions to this whole mess. The first, maybe the most obvious, that overnight, Brussels will ease regulations and give the European motor industry more time to adapt. However, that is unlikely. The second solution you may have thought of is to put very high tariffs on Chinese cars so that Europeans can remain competitive. Of course, this would not be good news either. Increased tariffs to penalize Chinese cars would mainly hurt consumers. They would have to pay more for the same cars that the EU authorities themselves are forcing them to buy by means of restrictions and taxes on combustion cars. Not only that, but the imposition of higher tariffs on Chinese cars could have dire consequences, both economically and politically. On the one hand, China would most likely respond with higher tariffs on European cars, which would generate panic in German manufacturers, whose main foreign market is precisely China. In fact, there is a whole war between France and Germany over this issue, because the French, who hardly sell anything in China, want to raise tariffs, while the Germans don't even want to hear about that possibility.
The French carmakers can say what others are thinking due to their minimal Chinese market exposure. The Germans have their mouths taped as they are petrified of a retaliation from their cash cow market where they are heavily, or now even potentially dangerously, exposed. Mercedes has its largest plant in China. It would be stupid to start a trade war with China because the Chinese would take countermeasures.
Another solution could be to copy the United States. But what have they done in Washington? Well, leaving aside the small detail that in the United States, the tariff on Chinese cars is 27.5%, and not 10% as it is in Europe, what the Americans have done is not to finance these cars with government money. You see, in Europe, anyone who buys an electric car, regardless of its origin, receives significant aid in the form of direct subsidies or tax breaks. Meanwhile, in the United States, with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, subsidies for the purchase of electric cars are restricted. Only cars assembled in the United States are eligible for aid, and those that are not, well, they are practically left out of the most lucrative market in the world. And that's what explains news items like this.
$210 billion of announced investments in electric vehicle manufacturing headed for the U.S. Not only will local automakers need to source battery components closer to home, but foreign auto brands that depend heavily on US-based sales, such as VW, Mercedes, Toyota, and Hyundai, will also need to shift their supply chain from Europe to Asia to North America to remain competitive in the market and gain the benefits of the tax break incentive.
And yes, I know what you're thinking. This is a blatant form of protectionism, and you are right. Ambitious European regulations are putting the automotive industry on the ropes, and at the moment, no solution seems to be a good one. It is often much easier to create problems than to solve them. But having come this far and taking into account these possibilities under discussion by politicians, experts, and governments around the world, the question is over to all of you. What do you think of the fact that instead of taking care of its main productive and advanced industry, the European Union is putting all possible obstacles in its way? Do you think the restrictions and heavy regulations on the combustion car should be reversed? Could the land of the Mercedes, BMW, Renault, or Ferrari end up flooded with Chinese electric cars? Leave us your impressions below in the comments. And remember, if you like this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to Visualeconomik so you don't miss any news. Once again, thank you so much for being there. All the best. See you next time.